Hi everybody, and welcome to the Center for South Asia. This talk today is also co-sponsored by the Department for Religious Studies at Stanford, and I would like to thank the CSA Director, Professor Anna Bigelow, Lalita Duparon, and Simrat Kaur Mathuru for organizing today. And I'm Sharika Thiranagama, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stanford. I would like to first begin by saying on behalf of the Center for South Asia that we recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muekuma Ohlone tribe, and we are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity to Indigenous struggles. I would also like to add that I personally am speaking from and residing in the ancestral lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, which is currently named as Menlo Park. So thank you all for being here for this and for allowing me to welcome our wonderful speaker, Professor Chinnaiah Jangam, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University. He holds an MA in history from the University of Hyderabad, an MPhil in modern Indian history from JNU, and a PhD from SOAS in University of London. His first book, Dalits and the Making of Modern India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017 and was included as one of the 12 most important books of Dalits writing by Caravan magazine recently. In his book, Professor Jangam presents Dalit perspectives on nationalism and argues that Dalits were equal participants in the imagination and the politics of the formation of independent India. And he writes that his research and writing seeks to illuminate the histories of marginalization and resistance through the lens of Dalits, and attempts to construct a historical narrative of anti-caste epistemology as a stepping stone to an ethical and egalitarian world. And these are all in Professor Jangam's own words. At the moment, Professor Jangam is doing multiple projects. He's writing a memoir about his mother, Chinnaiah Jangam, also known as Devadu Chinnaka. He's doing a project on the everyday experiences of the educated Dalit middle class. He has also translated Gabilan, the Bat, a Telugu classic, Dalits by a Dalit writer, written in 1941 by Guram Joshua, and which is forthcoming by Yoda Press 2022. And he's also writing a longue durée history of caste that traces the history of caste back to its pre-colonial roots in Hindu Brahmanical religious and secular texts, work that he argues laid the ethical, social, and religious foundation of caste. And today's talk is part of that longue durée history. Professor Jangam's articles and books are path-breaking, and I urge you all to read them. He illuminates the very long history of anti-caste protests and writing, explicitly reflecting upon the experience of communities subjected to deep caste inequity, which is older than the nationalist movement in India, but is minoritized and often ignored, while the nation is naturalizing contemporary writings on South Asia, especially by those historians who commit themselves to an engagement of subaltern history, but don't foreground caste or caste critique. Professor Jangam explores how 19th and 20th century Dalit Telugu writers imagined and engaged with the questions of the nation, colonial rule, and they fashioned new emancipatory projects grounded in an anti-caste vision. And it's a kind of methodological, theoretical, and historical tour de force in pointing not only to a history that is little acknowledged, but by showing the multiple sources and theoretical paradigms by which these histories can be approached, and thus foregrounding an archive which challenges the histories that many of us are taught. In short, I'm so delighted to welcome and learn from Professor Chinnaiah Jangam, and I welcome him to the Center for South Asia at Stanford. Jai Bhim.
Thank you, Sharika, and I will start with sharing my. Can you all see?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, thank you very much, Sharika, Lalita, and Simrat for this organizing talk, and also to Center for South Asian Studies at Stanford University for inviting me. And just now, Sharika told me that this is the inaugural kind of lecture on anti-caste histories, and epistemologists. I'm really, feeling honored to be part of this conversation, and I hope this will start a new kind of engagement about anti-caste histories, particularly in the context of South Asia and the kind of world we live in. I think particularly related to anti-racism, anti-casteism, and various forms of discriminations and exclusions of indigenous communities. And I see that this 2020s is like a new kind of tidal wave, which has begun particularly from marginalized communities across the world, which can be seen as indigenous and other people. So in this context, I think my talk is part of this larger engagement. As just now Sharika pointed out, I write on the history of Dalits, and have been grappling with the idea of understanding of caste for very long. As a historian of modern South Asia, particularly, my understanding of caste has been so far through the lens of modernity, particularly colonial modernity. So in this context, most of the work, the post-colonial works or sociological and anthropological works, mostly viewed caste as as the given phenomena. So in this context, what had happened that the modernity itself limited the very idea of understanding of caste. So in this context, I started thinking and writing and reading about caste histories, and in this context, I think my new book project, which tries to weave the history of caste, long durée history of caste, tries to present from ancient to contemporary times. In that context, last April, I presented work at UPenn and on the decolonizing of caste, and now this is the talk which basically focuses on the Hinduism as a phenomena and as a religion. And it's also driven by two important questions. One is most of us familiar with South Asia, particularly India, know that India is facing a very important challenge with the Hindutva politics. And people, observers, and historians and people who are familiar with South Asia have never imagined that India could go back to such regressive right-wing politics. But most of the time people thought that India being the so-called world's biggest democracy with lots of pluralism, inclusiveness, and all kinds of politics, people thought that it was presented as a model to the decolonized or third world countries. So in this context, India is experiencing a very different sort of politics now, the majoritarian communalism, everyday violence, and kind of things in India, things happening in India. At one level, it is shocking many people, and it's also making the world to see things in a very different way, because that is not the way in which world has seen Hinduism or India, for that matter. Hinduism is presented as this very nice, yoga-loving, non-violent religion, which basically, doesn't do any harm. But everyday reality is very different. So in this context, to place this contemporary context, I thought, it's better we have to go back to past to understand the paradox of Hinduism. So that's why, I thought, I should look at the history of Hinduism to understand that. And so it is also embedded in this whole process of understanding is this unearthing the history of caste, basically, which is invisible. Like as Sharika in the introduction pointed out, people who claim to write radical histories as the subaltern studies or Marxist historians, most of the time what happens is that caste is invisible for them. Like they don't even see that it exists. So in this context, what you see is that, to understand caste, one has to look back into this whole idea of Hinduism itself. So in this context, I was trying to look at the Hinduism, the way Amy Césaire, in his famous essays on colonialism, Discourse on Colonialism, has looked at the idea of Nazism. In fact, in 1950s, in his lectures, he pointed out that, the way Nazism came to Europe to hunt, basically, it was not something new. It was what Europeans were, the violence and the Holocaust, everything, they all were experimented in colonies, like either in Americas or even for that matter, different colonial projects. And in this context, what you see is that even about Hinduism, if you really want to understand the present, particularly why is it that so much violence is being unleashed and normalized, and one has to go back to history. So what I will do is that I will try to read, basically reading history backward, like particularly from the time of ancient time onwards, how this whole idea of development of religion, and also based on these Brahmanical ideas of caste and inequality, and how that becomes foundational. And other important aspect, again, as I pointed out, the paradox of Hinduism and Hindutva, how far they are different. Like many times what happens is that even in North America, especially in response to the Hindu right politics, there is this well-meaning intellectuals and activists who are trying to say that Hindutva is different from Hinduism, and there are in fact various kind of organizations which are trying to advocate that to salvage Hinduism from the onslaught of Hindutva. And how far that can really happen, that's what I wanted to see. And the second thing, again, as I pointed out, the colonial modernity basically has limitations, and that's why the understanding pre-colonial history and interconnecting them is very critical to writing long duration history of caste. The other phenomena related to, again, in the context of Dalit studies, is that that at one level Dalit epistemology or anti-caste epistemology originates along with the caste, and it runs as a parallel theme with which most of the time it survives in the form of oral testimonies and also as storytelling, but that has never become part of the historical tradition. So in this context, even to understand anti-caste epistemology, one of the important things we have to do is that look at Sanskrit texts, particularly both secular and also religious texts. And in fact, Ambedkar was very serious about Sanskrit at one level. And in fact, he himself wanted to do a degree in Sanskrit at Bonn University in Germany. So in this context, to write the histories of anti-caste, egalitarianism, one of the important ways is that critically engaging with Sanskrit is very, very important, particularly the classical text. So this is an attempt I'm trying to make to understand that. So in this context, to understand the ancient history, or the way in which the idea of Hinduism has evolved, one of the best way to engage is through the again Indology or Orientalism or Indo-European studies, particularly, which actually brought this idea of Hinduism to the forefront in 19th century. Like before that, no one knew that people in India were called as Hindus, and it is 19th century phenomena which basically becomes the construction of Hinduism becomes very central. So in this project of construction of Hinduism, again, the Europeans' engagement with Sanskrit is very, very critical. Particularly, it starts with some various missionaries, in 18th century, the first, in Malabar or Western India, southwest of India, when missionaries have arrived, one of the things they try to do is that they try to understand, engagement with Sanskrit becomes very, very important, because what they try to see is that they try to understand the Brahmanical practices, and because Brahmanism is very importantly tied to the knowledge of Sanskrit being the monopoly of Brahmins, it becomes very critical for them to engage with Sanskrit to understand what Brahmanism is all about. So in this context, what you see is that 18th century missionaries basically started seeing this very interesting kinship between Sanskrit and also European languages. And in this context, what happens is that they went to the extent of relating Brahmins to the Europeans. So in this context, if you look at the development of Indology, late 18th and 19th centuries, is very, very critical to understanding the way in which religion called Hinduism gets produced through the discourses and analysis of different translations by Europeans. Particularly, they're not just English, both French, English, and German. These are the three of them basically phenomenally contributed to the idea of development of the Sanskrit studies, which ultimately what happens is that produces this fascinating engagement with the idea of Brahmanical Hinduism. So in this context, what I see that, if you look at the early Indologists, either it could be Charles Wilkins, who translated Bhagavad Gita, and also William Jones, who translated Abhignana Shakuntalam and Gita Govindam, and also establishment of Asiatic Society of Bengal. And what you see is that, there is this deeply Brahmanical understanding of history. Like that's one of the things, you see that what happens is that, in this European engagement with the idea of Sanskrit and understanding Sanskrit text, what happens is that, they go to the extent of seeing that, history of India begins with the arrival of Aryans. So the Aryanization is equated with the idea of starting history in India. So in this context, what you see that, like French also, for example, like, French Antiqual Dipperin basically translated the Upanishads from Persian into, English, French. So in this context, like again, Alexander Hamilton, basically the first person to teach Sanskrit in Europe. Again, from them, what happens is that it is French who passed the tradition of studying Sanskrit to Germans. And that's how, what you see is that, by early 19th century, what you see that across Europe, from Germany, France to England, you see that, Sanskrit becomes very, very important, and many universities starts having, programs on Sanskrit. So with this, what you see is that, you have this very, very interesting development across 19th century in Europe. You see that, they have, engaged and also trying to see that, Sanskrit becomes very important way to understand India and also understand East, particularly for them, the East means India. So in this context, what you see is that, Franz Bopp, again, another German basically, who for the first time sees that this interconnection between Sanskrit and Indo-European languages. And in fact, the Sanskrit German, dictionary, you will be very surprised, was published by the Russian Imperial Academy. And what you see is that, the Western engagement with Sanskrit becomes very, very important aspect across the countries. Like, what you see that the modern European countries, including Russia, for example, becomes very, very important. So in this context, this whole series, which again, famously Max Muller basically, leads this project of translation of sacred books of the East, where basically in Oxford, that becomes a very, very important project. And mostly what you see is that, this Indological obsession with Sanskrit, what happens is that comes at the expense of social reality and also material history of India, where basically, like what you see that, the construction of religion and also construction of history goes hand in hand by becoming this whole idea of even this whole idea of spirituality, like, which basically even now, one of the important image about India is that, India means, people, who does yoga mats and also people who are very, overwhelmingly spiritual, and all these things comes part of this larger construction of Indologists across the world. So like in this context, what happens is that, India stands out as a very, very different colonial experience compared to any other places. That I think India is the only colony through which basically Europeans very passionately engage in understanding the culture and also rewriting the history. Like in this context, what we see that, Europe developed this very interesting fascination, and also what happens is that, passion for Sanskrit. So with this, what you see is that, you have this already the Sanskrit oriented studies and Sanskrit oriented, cultural developments becomes very important. Symbols of India gets constructed. So in this context, what you see is that by 19th century, what happens is that, they start using Sanskrit means, Sanskrit Brahmanism, and Brahmanism gets replaced by Hinduism. And as we see, like, it's basically geographical identity, which basically comes again, the very idea of Hindu comes from Persian word, identified with Indus River, and again, Persians who could not spell S used H. And that's how basically what you see is that, the Sindhus becomes Hindus. And the geographical phenomena, what happens is that, becomes very important, not just identity, but also it transforms, like, the Sanskrit Brahmanical tradition gets identified with this old people living in this region, and people across the caste and regions gets identified as Hindus. So in this context, what we see is that, the translation of, the way in which the transition of Brahmanism to Hinduism becomes very important. And in this, one of the important thing is that, this whole idea of glorification of India, or for that matter, the ancient India, valorization of ancient India as this very, very important, and not just important, but also as this very classical civilization, which is very spiritual, and also which had a very different sort of, kind of, eulogization of India becomes very important in the writings of European Indologists. In fact, as late as 1954, people like, A.L. Basham writing about India, saying that, Indian history, ancient Indian history, saying that, there is no, to us, the most striking feature of ancient Indian civilization is its humanity. And then, if you look at, in the same way, they also look at a very interesting parallel between Aryan, migrations into Indian subcontinent and the way in which the Europeans have conquered New World, particularly the Americas. And they see very interesting parallelism between this colonization of India by Aryans and also colonization of Europeans of the Americas. So in this context, what you see is that there is this very interesting contradiction. If you look at Indological texts and read the text, one of the important things you see that at one level they valorize Brahmanism. They try to present this as a very, very different phenomena, and they try to absolve Brahmanism of any sort of inequalities or injustice, and they try to praise it. At other level, what happens is that they cannot escape pointing out the realities, like for example, caste inequality. They have to acknowledge. So in this context, what happens is that they constructed Brahmanism basically as Hinduism, and with this, what happens is that with 19th century engagement, you see that you have this very interesting phenomena of this whole idea of reconstructing spirituality, and also engagement, translations of different texts, basically religious Brahmanical texts, like taking from Rig Veda to other three Vedas, latter three Vedas, Samaveda, Ajurveda, and others, and also Brahmanas and Upanishads, and Mahabharata and Ramayana. And the most important thing is that Bhagavad Gita, which basically tries to summarize the philosophical essence of most of the texts, and tries to present this spiritualized religious ideas about the kind of society they visualize, and the way in which it tries to imagine basically the Mahabharata or Kurukshetra war, for example, as the whole idea of separation of soul from the body. Like when, for example, when the beginning of the Kurukshetra war, when Arjuna, when he gets ready for the war, when he goes and looks at all his relatives, standing opposite side, and he was supposed to kill them, he refuses to fight. Nakankshe Vijayam Krishna. One of the first things he tells Krishna that, I don't want any victory at the cost of the lives of my relatives. And he refuses to fight, and he throws his, so in this context, Krishna, what he does is that, the whole Mahabharata is about justification of war. He tries to tell that, you're only killing the human body, not the soul. Soul has no death. And in this context, what happens is that, from justifying the war to what happens is that if you look at the latter reiterations and translations of Bhagavad Gita, one of the important things is that, it also goes into social phenomena, where basically the caste inequality also gets justified as part of this whole idea of karma and dharma, basically individual performing his dharmic duty, and karma becomes his deed, basically. One of the things it tries to tell is that you only have duty to perform. You can't think about the consequences of that duty, and on the fruits of the duty, you should not be responsible. So in this context, what happens is that each of these Sanskrit, particularly Bhagavad Gita, is one of the important things is that it tries to provide this very interesting justification for caste ordering of society, in which basically violence becomes very, very important, ways through which basically justification gets provided, and that gets spiritualized. So in this context, what you see is that, if you look on my slide, what the whole idea of this Chaturvarna Maya Srishtam, it is, it's a creation of the, the very idea of inequality comes out of this whole idea of religious philosophy. So in this context, what happens is that, Hinduism, Brahmanism, which is the precursor to the idea of Hinduism, it doesn't believe in equality, and also humanism or justice. And inequality becomes very, very important ways in which the society gets organized. And that's what, like you see that the architecture of Hinduism, like what you see that, caste becomes an invisible phenomena on which basically every other foundation gets founded. So in this context, what happens is that, when Europeans basically encounter India, like, the so-called Indian civilization or Hindu civilizations, one of the important things for them is that, the way in which the caste society gets organized, especially in terms of surplus extraction, like, the caste is the most efficient form of free labor and also surplus extraction. If you look at pre-colonial India, the early modern period, particularly when Europeans have started arriving, 14th and 15th century, when Indian subcontinent was, one of the important contributor to the world trade, and also providing spices, textiles, and all other forms of luxury goods to the world markets. All that, who is producing? Weavers. The best weavers are lower caste people. Like even now, all the weavers, they are not privileged upper caste. They are all coming from backward caste or Dalit caste. And, again, people who are engaged in agriculture are not free labor, basically. The caste-based free labor is very central to the idea of profits for them. So in this context, what happens is that, when Europeans encounter Indian society, one of the things they find is that, the efficient management of the system. So in this context, what happens is that, caste in a way becomes a very important, way in which society can be organized. And that's why what happens is that, Europeans do not find any moral or ethical quandary when they see this system, because it works efficiently for them. So with this, what happens is that, even before that, if you go into medieval period, like medieval history, many of the time, like, Hindu right particularly tries to identify that as a, Islamic rule, and Muslims have done this and that. But actually, if you look at medieval, period, one of the important thing is that, like Islamic conquest is a political conquest. It has nothing to do with religion. And most importantly, what happens is that, and Islam, though it's an egalitarian religion and, it believed in equality, everything, none of the Islamic rulers are worried about what, caste inequality or caste injustice. They're very indifferent. And that's one of the reasons why you see that, from like Delhi Sultanate to all the way till, Mughals in 18th and 18th century, one of the important things is that, Sanskrit and Persian, the exchange of texts and translations from each other's, it becomes very important. So what you see is that, Brahmanical elites and Muslim political elites are interacting without any problems. There is an important alliance between them. Thus, what happens is that at one level, within Islamic courts, you see that Brahmin Pandits working on translating texts. At the other level, what you see that, across India, if you look at different regional dynasties, one of the important things you see that, that Brahmanism was thriving. Like, across you see that, Pandyas in southern India, or Rashtrakutas in western India, and in southeast India, and across what you see that medieval period, also the period in which basically Brahmanism, there is a renaissance of Brahmanism. Temple architecture across India was booming. And second thing is that Buddhists were persecuted and Jain temples were converted into Hindu temples. And in this context, what you see that at one level you see that caste-based society gets organized so efficiently that to run that empires and also kingdoms, you have enormous free labor at the disposal of the state and also disposal of the caste Hindu elites. So in this context, what you see is that you have this very interesting medieval period also, along with Islamic rule, you also see that renaissance of Brahmanism. Because at one level, you also see that medieval period also the time in which anti-caste movements became very, very important challenges to the Brahmanism. Like, for example, Lingayat movement in present-day Karnataka and Telangana areas was a very important challenge to Brahmanism. And Vaishnavism in Bengal, for example, like across India, what you can see is that like medieval period also contested the Brahmanical domination. But one of the important things about Brahmanism is that every time an anti-caste movement comes in, it was able to efficiently assimilate those movements into its frame. So with this, what you see is that you see that this whole idea of anti-caste movements are developing, and there was a challenge to Brahmanism. But what you see is that the regional kingdoms across India particularly in different places, like from Bengal to, coming into all the way to Telugu and Karnataka states. One of the important things you see that, different regional languages are trying to reproduce the Vedic and the Brahmanical, texts into different languages. Like that's one of the reasons why you see that, 12th and 13th century Telugu literature has enormous development in terms of translation of Mahabharata, Ramayana epics into Telugu, and also the different religious texts. So in this context, what we see, regional kingdoms, so sought their legitimacy through Brahmanical rituals and Brahmanical texts. That's why you see that, early modern period in Vijayanagara Empire, like for example, like Vijayanagara Empire also becomes very important symbol in terms of, what you call the revival of Brahmanism and Sanskrit literature. So like a different sort of thing, what you see that, like with this, what you see that, the medieval and early modern period also becomes very, very important phenomena through which Brahmanism thrives in. And with this, what you see that, and so with this caste architecture, one of the important things is that, throughout history, the Hinduism and Brahmanism, one of the important things it does is that, it provides this stability, particularly socio-economic stability, on which different political dynasties and different, political systems thrive and also perish. So with this, what happens is that, caste architecture becomes a very important foundation when even colonialism, when it encounters. One of the important things is that, it doesn't have to do fundamental changes. And what it does is that, it uses that very idea of constructing new religion, particularly as we've seen the Indological construction of Hinduism. One of the important things is that, this whole idea of majority minority communities. And with this, what happens is that, if you're familiar with South Asian history, one of the important things is that, the divide and rule, particularly the Hindu-Muslim divide, becomes very critical to the idea of reorganization of colonial societies. So with this, what happens is that, instead of recognizing individuals in India in colonial settings, what happens is that Europeans start recognizing communities and religions. Thus, what happens is that, at one level, they use the existing architecture to reframe and re-enhance the existing social and also economic exploitative systems in a very efficient way. Thus, what happens is that, like despite European modernity, everything, caste was not an ethical problem for Europeans. Like, it becomes very important for them. And another important thing is that, because they are upholding the caste hierarchy, one of the important things is that, instead of making enemies of privileged caste Hindus, they start assimilating them. That's why what is that, early 19th century, onwards, you see that Indians, like, going to, England to pursue the, law and other, sort of European education, British education, and coming back to India to work in colonial, structures of power. So with this, what happens is that, you have this very interesting phenomena, caste Hindu elites, who got exposed to European English education, becomes very important bureaucrats and also people who implement colonial rule. And they are the one who basically becomes very important backbone to the structures of society, particularly colonial society. So in this context, what happens is that, like that's unlike other colonial settings. Just now, we are acknowledging, genocides and also the way in which displacements have happened in Americas, particularly the indigenous communities. So India basically stands out as a very different case, precisely because what happens is that, the exploitative architecture and system is efficiently organized around caste. Thus, what happens is that, like protecting that system becomes very important, for both for caste Hindu elites and also colonial elites. That's why what happens is that, like British, without much bloodshed, unlike other settings, what happens is that, Brahmanism facilitates this exploitative order. That's why what happens is that, they try to use this as a very important framework. Basically, this becomes, in my latter, in other writings, I try to argue that, that's how what you see is that, caste becomes a very important, framework or template for organizing racialized societies in different colonial settings. And with this, what happens is that, it is also beneficial to caste Hindus. What happens is that, as we said, Indological obsession with Sanskrit and other things, what happens is that it presents Hinduism as the most exotic religion. It's very interesting to see. And like the way in which Indians get treated, particularly when they go into metropolitan settings like in London and here and there. In fact, if you read Gandhi's autobiography, in fact, you will be very surprised. He discovers Hindu religion not in India. He discovers it in England, because when he was searching for vegetarian restaurants, when he encounters white people and when they talk about Bhagavad Gita and whether they ask him whether he read the text or not, they will get surprised. And he reads Bhagavad Gita in England, not in India. And it's very interesting to see this whole idea of the understanding and exoticization of Hinduism becomes very, very important. That is what you see like in North America today, like Europe, yoga studios, 1970s onwards, like this whole phenomenon of yoga is part of this obsession with Indian culture. And with this, what you see is that, it became win-win situation for both colonial masters and also in the context of, Indian elites, particularly caste in the privileged elites. And with this, what happens is that, when you talk about Hinduism, Hindutva and decolonization, one of the important things we have to understand is that, are they really different? Like if this is what the architecture of society, particular religion, basically the very foundational ethics of religion, which doesn't believe in human equality, in justice and dignity. And then what happens is that, when we see that, the transition of Hinduism from Hindutva, one of the important things you have to understand is that, this, I think, dilemma was faced even by, nationalists like Gandhi, Nehru and other people. Like particularly Gandhi's life is a very, very interesting reflection of this blurring of Hinduism with Hindutva. Like where basically Gandhi believed that he himself as a Sanatanist, he tried to justify caste system and also various kinds of things as part of this protecting Hinduism from the onslaught of the Hindutva or right-wing. So in this context, what happens is, but Gandhi, what happens is that, he basically, despite his being a strong Hindu and trying to, say that, Hinduism is present Hinduism in a very different framework. At the end of the day, what happens is that, the militant or fundamentalist Hindus did not feel that, were not comfortable with the interpretation of, Gandhi. In fact, that's one of the reasons why, Gandhi gets killed by a Chitpavan Brahmin, not by a Dalit or a Muslim. And that's what it's very interesting to see why today's Hindutva is, not just aberration from what it was. That's how the very foundational, that's what, if you really want to do this, the decolonizing Hinduism, one of the important things you have to see is that if you really want to challenge Hindutva, you have to question the fundamental tenets of Hinduism. Because what happens is that, the very idea of religion, is imbued with this idea of inequality and injustice. That's why what you see that, caste Hindus were very entitled people. Like they don't have moral guilt about either about caste atrocities or atrocities against Muslims or condition of Dalits or Adivasis. That's why you see that, like across, the world, when we are having this anti-race protests and, racial oppression, like caste oppression doesn't, come in it doesn't come in any discussions. And the entitled caste Hindus feel that, they don't even have any moral guilt, precisely because what happens is that that's what Brahmanism teaches them. It naturalizes inequality, it naturalizes dehumanization, it naturalizes, women's mistreatment. And these are all part of this larger ethical continuation, which becomes, dehumanization and, devaluation of human beings is part of this larger frame of Brahmanism. So in this context, if you really want to challenge Hindutva and provide, different sort of ethic to redo the phenomena of, Indian politics or democracy, one of the important things we have to do is that, we should question the fundamental tenets of this religion. Unless we question and decolonize, particularly the Sanskrit obsessed Indological construction needs to be deconstructed. Unless you do that and include anti-caste perspective, you cannot have a religion or a democracy in which people can live as equals and also share the country's destiny as equals. And Jai Bhim, I will stop it here and we'll have more in.
Thank you so much, Chinnaiah, for that. And there's a number of questions in the Q&A box that I will start asking. So as you've ended up on a contemporary note, I'm going to first ask one of the questions, which is about what's happening right now. And then there's a number of questions which are about specific parts of your talk and Sanskrit. So let me start with Roy Montana's question, which is, caste discrimination in India has been terrible for ages. Caste discrimination parallels racial color discrimination in the West. Now caste is exported to the US West. What can be done so US governments and corporations recognize it and put proper controls law in place? Cisco caste discrimination is not properly handled by courts and Cisco itself. What are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you for that question. And yeah, it's something, I think diaspora is one of the important responsibility. I think many people are already doing that talking about this, caste discrimination, even in America, like, as we have seen, like in last 10 years, like American Hindu Foundation, for example, spearheading a campaign to, any sort of discussion about, caste or caste discrimination in North America. And in this context, I think, already we have very interesting activists like across North America, particularly Equality Labs is doing phenomenal work. And recently, many universities are, recognizing caste discrimination and including in their, diversity and also inclusion and other, a sort of protected category along with race and gender. So with this, what you see that, I think this is the responsibility of diaspora to talk again, recognize caste, that it's a reality. Like the way we recognize racism, we need to recognize casteism as a very important reality, not only in India, but also among diaspora. And in fact, North America also, you have a lot of cases, like Cisco case is a very important way in which it pointed out that, even in corporations, it exists. And if you look at, recently I met a scholar who just did a PhD, finished on Infosys and other companies in India, where basically the promotions and other things. In fact, Thomas did a fantastic work about caste. In fact, the professor at Stanford, like they did a fantastic work about how caste discrimination happens in corporate world by sending, CVs to different companies with, same qualifications, higher caste surname and lower caste surname. So I think, I think now world is getting, to know about caste discrimination. I think the only thing we have to do is that, we really need to talk more about it. And thank you for that question, right?
Great. I'm going to ask you two questions about which specifically about Sanskrit. So Srihas Tamareddy asks, is there a possibility of pre-Vedic or pre-Sanskritized nation before the rise of Hinduism? Do you think that there's something like Dravidian or South Indian religion or culture? This is for us South Indians here, or but and another related, different question on a different note is Junaid Sheikh asks, it says, great talk, Chinnaiah, thank you. Could you say more about Ambedkar's desire to learn Sanskrit? Did he want to learn the language of the oppressor, so to speak, or did he want to learn Sanskrit to write an alternative history of Hinduism?
Oh, thank you. That's a fantastic, June. Thank you. And also other question also. And yeah, this is very interesting. Like, can we write non-Sanskrit, alternative history? Like particularly, I think that's one of the important thing. The anti-caste epistemology. That's what, like, the alternative histories. If we really want to do it, one of the ways in which Tamil tradition. Like, that's like Tamil has a very fascinating tradition compared to any other language, particularly producing what you call alternative histories, particularly anti-caste and also non-caste histories. They are all, more egalitarian. That's one of the things. If you look at Indological histories, Indological writings, they are at loss precisely because, their whole obsession with Sanskrit, they only begin like, in fact, Nilakanta Shastri, there is this very interesting South Indian historian called Nilakanta Shastri, who wrote History of South India. And his chapter begins with, Aryanization. Aryanization of South India, that is the beginning of South Indian history for him. And that's why, that's one of the ways in which we can do is that, looking for alternative sources is a very, very important aspect, particularly both oral tradition and also archaeological traditions. I think there's a lot of pre-writing period, and also there's a lot of history in terms of archaeology, which is, very important part of this tradition. I think that's why, my interest in this pre-colonial history is precisely because of that. We cannot really, comprehend the existence of a civilization for 3,500 years or 4,000 years just by looking at the Sanskrit tradition, because we existed outside the tradition, particularly Dalits and other communities who are not given access to the written tradition. So our history needs to be constructed parallel to Sanskrit tradition. And to answer the question related to Sanskrit and Ambedkar, that's what it's very interesting. Ambedkar, in fact, you look at one of the things Ambedkar did is that he used to use the master's tools to destroy the master's house. That is what the strategy. That's why if you look at the Annihilation of Caste, or who are Shudras, all these books, if you look at, he uses Hindu text to deconstruct Hinduism, riddles of Rama and Krishna. He is not worshipping Rama or Krishna. He's basically deconstructing Rama and Krishna by using the same narrative. That's why, these days I am also reading and also listening to Mahabharata regularly. And I have a 16-year-old son who thinks that, we are all radicals. And every time he comes and laughs at me saying that, Dad, what are you doing? Because I listen to Mahabharata. He says, are you becoming Hindu? And that's what it's very interesting to see. Every time I listen to it, every time I try to look at it, read, understand in a very different way. I'm not a worshipper of Rama or Krishna, but I want to know what they have said about me, my community, and how they justified injustice. That's what, for me, one of the way. Why do we have to read this text? Because what is the reason and logic they are using? Because that's what people when I look at Amy Caesar's discourse on colonialism, he says bar of reason and bar of very important. When you really want to justify, Europe cannot justify racism because it doesn't go with reason. And that's what the Hindu reason needs to be deconstructed by using the Sanskrit itself.
Okay, so I have a host of questions now on Hinduism, and then I have some questions on the historical and political configuration. So there's so many questions, audience, that I'm putting some together. I hope you all forgive me. So I have a number of questions on Hinduism. For example, Srinivasan asked, does the Rig Veda mention anything about Dalits? It only mentions Sudra, and asks, in your mind, why is Hindutva practiced by other Hindu castes, not merely Brahmins? After all, Brahmins are only a small minority of Hindus. Another, Ashwin Ramaswamy asks, you said that separating Hindutva from Hinduism is misguided because it requires questioning the fundamentals of Hinduism, but doesn't Gandhi's murder by Hindu fundamentalists show that it's possible to challenge Hindutva without challenging the fundamental tenets of Hinduism, as Gandhi did? And in line with those questions, there are similar questions, but almost answering them. So Santosh Chandrasekhar asks, I am curious if decolonization of Hinduism is even possible. Does Dr. Jangam take decolonization of Hinduism to mean a critique of Hinduism? Another attendee asks, Randip Hoti, thanks you for calling attention to the fact that Hinduism is a product of colonial knowledge and Brahmanical colonial collaboration, and wonders whether it makes sense to ask whether rather than decolonizing Hinduism, we might decolonize from Hinduism. And his question comes out of anti-caste activism from the perspective of Sikh studies, and whether Sikhism has historically offered powerful anti-caste resources, while there is plenty of casteism in Sikh society. And you mentioned the importance of alternative resources for contesting casteism. So Sikhism is given as an example here, but I think there's a more general question whether you also think there are other alternative resources. So that's a lot of questions I have put together before the next one.
Very much. And in between, I lost your first question.
Well, about the Rig Veda, whether it mentions anything about Dalits.
Yeah, like, Rig Veda doesn't mention directly, but it does mention about Chandalas. Like there is a references related to Chandalas, and the references are there. Like regarding someone asked about, Brahmins are, minuscule minority, and actually other caste practice, casteism, everything. But one of the important things about Brahmins is that like you understand, elites will always be in minority in any society. Think about capitalism. Everyone is not, Elon Musk, or everyone is not what you call, like, rich and powerful will always be in minority. And the problem that's so the why is it that Brahmins are minuscule minority? Because that's how the system of privilege works. If you look at the caste architecture, pyramid works. Brahmin sits on the top, and Brahmin, by sitting on the top, what he did is that he kept monopoly of the text. He never allowed anyone else to read the text and interpret and reach the God. And he had control over, monopoly over the God. And rest of the society for centuries together, what happens is that everyone has to fall on the feet of the Brahmin. It is Brahmin creation which is very critical. Like unless you dismantle Brahmanism and Brahmin, you cannot dismantle caste. That's what is happening. Like Shivaji went through. Like, if you look at historical figures, how many of them suffered because of the Brahmanical monopoly and Brahmanical arrogance. And it happens, like, that's one of the reasons why within the structure you can, that's one of the reasons why Ambedkar said, you cannot reform this system because it's not democratic. That's where it's very, first you need to democratize. Like people like Kancha Ilaiah says all the time, there is a spiritual fascism because, even now, North America, go to any temple, will they allow non-Brahmin to become priest? Like you are in 21st century, and also you're in North America, which is supposed to be most advanced country. Go to any temple and tell that, I'm a Dalit, I want to be a priest here. Will they allow? No. A Brahmin who is an engineer will, come and become priest. Like, you see, like, this is what the Brahmanism problem is. It is not democratic religion. Like, in any other religion, you can become priest if you want, if you have, like, that's why, this Brahmanical audacity has become so problematic that, a Brahmin doctor, a Brahmin engineer, just because he can recite few Sanskrit slokas, they go and teach about, Hinduism courses in different universities in North America. I am facing in my university. A Brahmin doctor teaches a Hindu course on Hinduism. Can you imagine a white Christian coming to us and telling that, a doctor or engineer saying that, I want to teach a course on Christianity? Will you allow them? We don't allow, but a Brahmin can do that. That is the problem, that there is a fundamental problem. Unless you deconstruct Brahmins and Brahmanism, you cannot democratize that religion. So this apologies for, Brahmins saying that they're very minority, they don't even, they are the first beneficiaries of caste system and Hinduism. If they,
Fantastic. So I'm going to now just ask two quite different historical political questions. So the first comes from Anjali Arendekar, who says, J. Beam, two questions. One, how do you reconcile the colonial state's recognition of caste as a form of discrimination to combat the rise of the largely upper caste nationalist movement? Similarly, how do we make sense of the rise of Bahujan movements in regions such as Goa, where caste becomes the primarily mobilizing movement for freedom? First CM is a Bahujan capitalist under the aegis of a tolerant Hinduism. Second question, how do histories of gender segmentation intersect with the histories of labor segmentation that you are arguing are the foundations of Hinduism and Hindutva? Where is the gender of caste? So the two quite complicated questions, and I'm going to add more, Chinnaiah, sorry. And I have two questions from Anuba Anushri, and she asks, one, I would like to know, how did Brahmins contribute to the spiritualization and Brahmanization of Hinduism? I am thinking of recent critiques of people like Rajmohan Roy and Aurobindo Ghosh, who presented a spectrum of Brahmin responses of co-option to the colonial narratives of Hinduism as an occasionally violent but essentially benign religion. And the second question, which I think, you have so much work on. I'm also curious about the contributions of the Dalit and non-Savarnas to pre-colonial South Asia, and interested in knowing what you think about the current political appropriations of these non-Savarna poets and thinkers, Jalkari Bai, for example, by the nationalist. How does one, as a budding scholar of caste historiography in India, negotiate the challenge of countering these appropriations, as well as recognizing the importance of these figures and movements? So these are big questions. The second, I think, also speaks to your work.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I like this first question about how did the colonial states recognition of caste, basically, like at one level, this is where unintended consequence of colonialism. This is where I think, Anjali, it's very important that it's especially when it comes to the question of how Dalit Bahujans particularly entry into colonial institutions, particularly education, and also the awareness about their human rights. It is not something, it's not that in a pre-colonial era, Dalit Bahujans are not aware about their suffering and they did not articulate their suffering. They did articulate. One of the fundamental difference colonialism brings in is the tools of education, which provides this whole new phenomena of re-articulating the idea of equality and also contesting Brahmanical inequality. So in this context, what you see is that we see this fundamental contradiction in colonial experience, unintended consequences, which basically are very, very important, play a very important role. That's where, Ambedkar puts them in spot, right? At one level, you guys claim that you're liberals. At other level, you're also in alliance with upper caste Hindus. So therefore, what happens is that, why is it that, knowing very well that, Ambedkar is not an influential mobilizer in colonial India, still colonialism was forced to negotiate with him and recognize with him, precisely because he challenged them on their own ethical principles. Like, you look at Ambedkar's argument in, round table conference or in front of South Borough Committee or anything, any person with any reason and rationality could see that injustice happening to these people. So therefore, what happens is that, colonialism was put in a spot by this Dalit and Bahujan communities. Therefore, what happens is that, colonial public sphere is also the sphere on which basically you see that, particularly in South India, non-Brahmin movement becomes very, very important, precisely because, they started seeing the monopoly of Brahmins and the way in which Brahmanical oppression is happening. So in this context, what you see is that, you see this colonialism acting is a very important, harbinger at one level, but also the ally of oppressive caste Hindus. And in this context, the gender, labor, and caste, and that's I should have really pointed out, and thank you for pointing. And you cannot, separate caste from gender. Like, the monopoly over women and monopoly over, reproductive health of women is very critical to the idea of caste purity. And look at Manu Dharma Shastra. How many restrictions it puts about, what kind of marriage you can have, which caste can marry whom, and caste violation is a very important. That's where, if you look at the racial purity and caste purity, how they interact with each other is very, very important. So in this context, what happens is that gender, gendering caste, like the book, and if you look at anything like gender is very, very critical. You cannot, not only that reproduction, but also even in terms of organizing caste labor, like particularly both in agriculture fields and also in weaving communities. Women's labor is very, very critical. It is women basically who play a very important role in organizing the societies and also the economy. So in this context, I didn't talk about it, I'm sorry, but this is very, very critical. You cannot separate gender from caste because they are tied together. You can only explain them together to understand the caste histories. And the next question is about contribution of Dalit Bahujans in pre-colonial history. And thank you for that question also. At one level, this is what the parallel history, I'll tell you one small story about this. When American Baptist missions have arrived on Coromandel coast, And one of the things they try to do is that they struggle to convert people, particularly from upper caste and Brahmins. They did massive failure. In fact, it was started as Canadian Baptist missionaries. For 10 years, they tried to convert Brahmins into Christianity, and they miserably failed. And what they did is that, Canadian Baptist missionaries, while leaving, they give it to American Baptist missionaries, saying that you guys run this because we are unable to do anything. And then what happens is that, these American Baptist missions go to this Madiga community, who are basically, by the time they go there, they're already, engaged in a large anti-caste movement under the leadership of, Pothuluri Brahma, early modern anti-caste thinker, who was basically, if you go to Rayalaseema area, even now is seen as this very important saint who spoke against caste and other forms of discriminations and exploitations. And what they do is that they offer Bible as God who basically offers them equality, social equality. So in this context, what happens is that there is this very important phenomena of non-Brahmin, particularly Dalit and other communities who have engaged in this development of alternative spirituality from Brahmanism. And what happens is that, but the problem is that in contemporary India, one of the important things you see that in Bengal it happened, like for the BJP, the way it tried to appropriate these sects, basically the minor or major sects among Bahujans and also Dalits. What you see is that they always target people who are not beneficiaries of reservation system, and particularly among marginalized community, and also who have any sort of this sort of the different sort of spirituality. So that's how basically, if you Badoma in Bengal, for example, she's a very important symbol, and even in different figures, particularly both in Uttar Pradesh and other places, you see that the non-Chamar communities they try to use. So in this context, appropriations are happening. Like not only that, in fact, you'll be very surprised. Gond communities are building temples these days in Adilabad district, because that's how the Hinduism's biggest success is that either it forces or assimilates. That's how historical this thing. Either it elimination or assimilation. These are the strategies through which it tries to expand. So it is in the not just Hindutva politics. That's how Hinduism works.
So Chinnaiah, this is so rich, and I told the audience we could run for a few more minutes until 1:10 because there are so many questions. And I'm sorry, audience, there are lots of questions that I'm not going to get to, but given that this is a university, there's a whole bunch of questions about the academic world and caste. So I think maybe we could end by me reading out those questions in that sense. So there's Natasha Patel asks, how do you suggest we respond to academics who fail to recognize caste? In the academic world, I run into many Brahmins or members of the South Asian diaspora, India and Pakistan, who don't think caste is an important identity dimension, and they get recognition for their research. How do we successfully challenge this? Dipu Das asks, the admissions policies of Indian universities and local colleges loosely implement caste reservation given their own faculty and staff structure filled with upper caste Brahmins. What steps could be taken to better the situation, and how do we sensitize people about this issue? And Sanjita Dasgupta asks, Savarna dominance in US academia, especially in South Asia departments, is endemic. Sorry, we're going back and forth between India and the US. Savarnas can very easily appropriate anti-caste discourse and pad our CVs and get a lot of money for hosting events, but rarely does this translate to recruiting caste-oppressed South Asian students, teaching Ambedkar in classrooms and talking about the absolute necessity to annihilate caste. There are so many barriers for entry that Savarnas have created while also dominating anti-caste discourse. How does one combat this in academia? And maybe I thought it would be good to end on this note, given the nature of where we're both employed and the worlds that you address also in your research.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. This is very interesting. The first question about Savarnas are privileged caste Hindus in most of the North American, even European academia, who recognize. That's what one of the important thing. That's why, anti-colonial nationalism's biggest advantage for India is that, and people like Gandhi, they have done what they have done is that, they're putting India as this forerunner of anti-colonial nationalism, and what they did is that they created this global image as India as being this very important leader in terms of championing the causes of anti-colonialism. But otherwise, what happens is that, if you look at all these academics who are in different departments across North America, or even Europe, they're all privileged, mostly Brahmins, in fact, not even just privileged caste Hindus. Most of them are Brahmins. Can you imagine? These are the people who have education for thousands of years. And for them, English education also for them, 3 or 4 generations before only they learned English. No wonder post-colonial studies and post-colonial novels, Indians get prizes precisely because of that. The assimilation into colonial structures of power. And that's why, what is happening, that's one of the reasons why it is not in their interest to question caste, acknowledge caste. Because they deny precisely because of that. That's why they use multicultural politics, and they organize Diwali parties, because that makes white people to come and enjoy some sweets. Because that's how this market themselves. If not yoga, Diwali party, or otherwise Bollywood parties. Like that's how the cultural, the way in which the globalization of Hindu culture is very, very interesting phenomena. Because one of why they do is to deny the existence of caste. And that's one of the reasons I think, our responsibility is to speak about it. Tell them that it exists, and ask them, if you meet an Indian who denies caste, ask them what is their parents or what caste he comes from. That makes them put them on spot. And then again, the only way we can, really, build egalitarian society, and we can talk about injustices and other things. If you really want to do, the only way we can do is that speak about it. Whichever the forum you are in, whichever the party you are in, just acknowledge and tell. You don't have to be, holding a poster and walking on the road, but tell talk to your parents or talk to your relatives. Tell them that the privilege you enjoyed, and the people who don't have those privileges, and this is very important. And especially South Asian centers and academia, one of the important role they can do is that they can speak for it. They don't have to spend money. At least speak and acknowledge. That will bring a very important transformation.
Thank you so much, Chinnaiah. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. And I'm sorry I didn't get to ask all the questions. I will say that there's a number of questions, which is about how important your talk is, which raise the problem of asking whether we can decolonize Hinduism, how do we think about decoloniality instead of as a new way instead of post-coloniality, for example, and also concerns about how anti-caste heroes like Ambedkar are being appropriated to save Hinduism. But I think you covered so much, and I think that the note you ended on is so very important for us at the center, and also for all our listeners, especially our students who are trying to, think about how to have a more egalitarian anti-caste kind of critique of their own worlds as well. So thank you again, Professor Jangam.
And I really appreciate inviting me for this talk.
And thank you, audience, and Jai Bhim to you all. Thank you.